Maybe it will distress a lot of people, but I've had an awfully nice life.
There was a specific era in American entertainment when Judy Garland existed not merely as a performer, but as a cultural force. In the mid-20th century, she occupied a space in the public imagination that few artists ever reach. Presidents publicly admired her.
We're very appreciative to Miss Garland, our old friend, and to Mr. Lancaster.
Critics, usually restrained in their praise, often exhausted their vocabularies attempting to capture the specific resonance of her voice. When she walked onto a stage, the reaction was often visceral. Grown adults were known to weep before a single note had been sung. She was, in the truest sense of the word, an event.
All night long he calls her Snooky Ookums, Snooky Ookums.
To understand the trajectory of her final decade, one must first understand the height from which she eventually fell. For the vast majority of the public, Garland was permanently fixed in the amber of her youth. She remained Dorothy Gale from The Wizard of Oz, the girl in the gingham dress who assured a depression-weary nation that dreams could be realized.
A man made out of tin. Yes.
This image was potent, comforting, and remarkably durable. However, by the early 1960s, the reality of Garland's life had diverged sharply from the screen image. She was no longer a hopeful teenager. She was a woman who had survived decades of the studio system's rigorous and often damaging machinery. The public knew, or at least suspected, the details of her struggles, the dangerous cycles of prescription medication, the widely publicized breakdowns, the financial instability, and the dissolution of multiple marriages. Yet her ability to return to the stage remained uncanny. In the industry, she was viewed as the ultimate survivor, an artist who could endure personal catastrophe and still deliver performances of immense power. This resilience was not just a character trait. It became the central theme of her relationship with her audience. This dynamic reached its absolute zenith on the night of April 23, 1961 at Carnegie Hall. Historians and music critics frequently cite this specific evening as the single greatest concert in the history of show business. The claim is not made lightly. The context of the night was electric. Tickets had vanished almost instantly, and the 3,000 seats inside the theater were occupied by a cross-section of the cultural elite. Hollywood royalty, Broadway titans, and the era's most influential tastemakers had gathered, sensing that the performance would be significant. Myrna Loy was in the audience. Julie Andrews was shouting encouragement from the floor. Composers and actors filled the rows. When Garland stepped onto the stage that night, the reception was overwhelming. It was not polite applause, it was a deluge. Her daughter, Lorna Luft, would later recall watching the audience rise repeatedly, offering standing ovation after standing ovation, as if the physical act of sitting down was impossible in the face of such energy. The music director, Mort Lindsay, provided perhaps the most accurate description of the atmosphere. He noted that it did not feel like a standard concert. It felt, in his words, like a revival meeting. The connection between performer and audience had transcended entertainment and entered the realm of testimony. The recording of that performance, Judy at Carnegie Hall, captured this energy. It would go on to win multiple Grammy Awards and was eventually selected for preservation by the Library of Congress, recognized as an audio artifact of historical importance. At that moment, in the spring of 1961, it appeared that Garland had achieved the ultimate comeback. The night seemed to prove that no matter how difficult her personal circumstances became, the American public's affection for her was unbreakable. But the nature of fame is volatile, and public adoration is often more fragile than it appears. The distance between being an icon and being a pariah can be traversed with terrifying speed. The question that defined Garland's final years is a difficult one. How does an artist go from the adulation of Carnegie Hall to being booed off a stage just 3 years later? The answer to that question begins to take shape in 1964, 9,000 miles away from New York City, in Australia. The tour was orchestrated by promoter Harry M. Miller, who saw an opportunity to bring one of the world's biggest names to a new continent. Initially, the venture appeared successful. The audiences in Sydney were ecstatic, the reviews were glowing, and the crowds were large. For a brief window, it seemed as though the magic of 1961 had been successfully exported. But the stability was illusory. The tour moved to Melbourne, and it was there, on May 21, 1964, at Festival Hall, that the dynamic shifted. The venue was sold out. Thousands of fans had gathered, expecting the triumphant Queen of Carnegie Hall. Instead, they were met with silence. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 40. The anticipation in the hall began to curdle into irritation. By the time an hour had elapsed, the atmosphere in the arena had become heavy with heat and frustration. The audience, having paid a premium to see a legend, began checking their watches. The whispers in the crowd turned sharp. When Garland finally appeared, the visual contrast to her previous triumphs was stark. She did not look like the polished superstar the audience expected. She was dressed in street clothes. Her posture was poor, her energy scattered. The professional veneer that usually protected her seemed to have dissolved. Despite this, the audience initially withheld judgment, hoping the voice would redeem the delay. Garland attempted to rely on charm. "Let's all sing together," she urged the crowd, trying to bridge the gap that her lateness had created. For a moment, the tension softened, but the goodwill was tenuous. A voice from the darkness cut through the hall, shouting, "Have another brandy." The comment drew laughter. It was not the warm, shared laughter of a fan base in on the joke. It was dangerous laughter. It was the sound of a crowd turning on its subject. Garland pressed on, but it became immediately apparent that something was wrong. Her words were slurring, and she struggled to navigate the lyrics of songs she had sung thousands of times. In a confused display, she draped her microphone cord around a violinist and attempted to conduct the orchestra herself. The audience's mood shifted from restlessness to discomfort, and then to open hostility. In a moment of unguarded honesty, Garland admitted to the crowd, "I just couldn't get out of that hotel." It was an attempt to be human, to offer a reason for the delay. But honesty is a risky strategy when thousands of people feel disrespected. The admission did not land as an apology. It landed as an excuse. The boos began to rise. They started softly, isolated pockets of disapproval, but soon grew unmistakable. It is worth pausing to consider the psychological weight of that moment. A performer stands under blinding stage lights, unable to see the individual faces in the dark, hearing waves of rejection washing back toward them. It is a specific kind of nightmare. It brings panic, anger, and shame, but perhaps most devastatingly, it brings recognition. Recognition that the control is gone. Recognition that the magic is slipping away. Garland eventually did what many performers do when the room becomes untenable. She walked off. The orchestra, desperate to salvage the evening, played the opening bars of "Over the Rainbow" repeatedly, trying to lure her back. But the spell was broken. She did not return. The fallout was immediate and global. The next morning, newspapers around the world carried headlines detailing the disaster. "Riled Aussies hoot Judy off stage," read one. "Curtain cat calls," read another. Her management team attempted damage control, blaming the incident on allergies. Garland herself spoke of retirement, hinting that she might leave the concert stage for theater or comedy. The implication was clear. Just 3 years after the greatest night of her life, she was contemplating an escape from the very medium that had defined her. The Melbourne incident revealed an uncomfortable truth about the nature of celebrity. Audiences do not merely elevate legends, they also participate in their dismantling. For Garland, Melbourne was not an anomaly, it was a harbinger. The hardest nights were still ahead. By 1968, the unadulterated praise that had once followed Garland had grown unpredictable. The voice remained, often flashing with its old brilliance, and the legend was still intact. But the physical vessel carrying that legend was failing. Years of relentless touring, the cumulative effect of medication cycles, and the strain of pushing past physical limits were taking their toll. Garland subscribed to the old show business ethos that the show must go on, even when, medically speaking, it should not. On February 18, 1968, Garland was scheduled to perform at the Baltimore Civic Center. Outside, the scene was familiar, fans gathering with anticipation. Inside, the stage was set. But backstage, the situation was dire. Garland was suffering from a severe case of food poisoning. This was not stage fright or exhaustion. It was an acute physical illness. She was so weak that her conductor and her co-headliner, Tony Bennett, had to physically support her as she walked toward the stage. The image is striking. The woman who had once commanded Carnegie Hall with the force of a revival preacher now required physical assistance just to remain upright. Yet, when she reached the microphone, professional instinct took over. Garland understood that once the spotlight hits, the performer belongs to the audience. The orchestra began. She attempted the first number, but her voice wavered. She tried another, but the notes cracked and faltered. From somewhere in the arena, a sound sliced through the music. A single boo. In a concert hall, one boo can carry more weight than 1,000 cheers. It breaks the collective agreement of the room. Garland stopped singing. She looked out into the darkness and, with a disarming bluntness, addressed the heckler directly. "I don't feel so well," she said. "So if you feel that way, I'm going to go off." And she did. There was no dramatic flourish, no anger. She simply walked off the stage. In a standard narrative, this is where the scene would end. The legend collapses. The crowd wins. The curtain falls. But the reality of Judy Garland was more complex. Minutes later, she came back. The decision to return speaks volumes about her internal constitution. Quitting was not in her nature. When she reappeared, the atmosphere in the Civic Center had shifted. The audience was now a mix of irritated ticket holders, protective fans, and people who, seeing how visibly ill she was, felt a sense of heartbreak. Then came another heckle. This time, instead of shrinking, Garland engaged. She fired back with a line that displayed her sharp defensive wit. "Did you say boo or who?" Laughter rippled through the hall. The tension in the room cracked. For a moment, she regained control not through vocal perfection, but through personality. She followed up with a clarification. "I'm not the drunk you read about. I've had food poisoning." It was the unfiltered honesty that had come to define her later career. There was no polished public relations statement, no attempt to pretend everything was fine. It was just the messy, vulnerable truth. She restarted songs multiple times. Her voice continued to falter, but eventually she pushed through a rendition of Sawani. It was not flawless. It was not triumphant in the traditional sense, but it was courageous. Philip Goodman, the chairman of the Civic Center, later observed the audience's reaction. "The vast majority of customers were not angry," he noted. "They felt sorry for her." This observation suggests a profound shift in Garland's relationship with her public. Audiences didn't just admire her when she soared, they felt a deep, empathetic connection when she struggled. They were witnessing a human being fighting in real time. Garland left the stage in Baltimore physically depleted, but she had finished the show. However, the event served as another warning. The margin between triumph and disaster was growing thinner. The industry was taking notice. Promoters became wary. Insurance companies hesitated. But nothing, not the disaster in Melbourne, not the struggle in Baltimore, prepared audiences for the final chapter in London. By 1969, Judy Garland was fighting on multiple fronts. She was fighting time, fighting a dire financial situation, fighting deep loneliness, and fighting her own failing health. She needed to work. Years of financial mismanagement and exploitation had drained a fortune that should have been endless. She accepted a 5-week residency at the Talk of the Town nightclub in London. The Talk of the Town was a prestigious venue known for elegance. It was the kind of room where reputations were polished. Garland arrived there nearly broke. At first, there was hope. Fans lined up around the block, clinging to the possibility that the old magic would surface. And occasionally it did. But unpredictability had become her constant shadow. She arrived late, and then later. Some nights she smoked openly on stage. Some nights she drank. On several occasions, she pleaded for medication to steady her nerves before facing the crowd. The press watched closely, their pens sharpened. A review from The Observer during this period painted a haunting picture of the star. The critic described her as thinner now, almost haggard. With hand on hip, she struts and totters and prowls, tigerish and restless. The description was not cruel, it was a stunned observation of a legend flickering between brilliance and collapse. Garland herself seemed aware of the anachronism of her presence, rasping to the audience one night, "I haven't been taught anything new since silent movies." The line drew uneasy laughter, but beneath the humor sat a deep well of exhaustion. Then came the night that defined the residency's collapse. She entered over an hour late. She managed to sing only 3 songs before the room turned against her. Suddenly, a glass flew from the audience. It shattered on the stage behind her. This moment represents a violent crossing of the boundary between audience and performer. It was not a verbal disapproval, it was a physical attack. Garland fled the stage. Playwright Peter Quilter would later summarize the residency with brutal clarity. In 6 weeks at the talk of the town, everything came to a head. It was her emotional car crash. And yet, the paradox of Judy Garland persisted. Even during this downward spiral, people kept coming. They did not attend solely out of morbid curiosity. They came because somewhere beneath the fragility, the voice still lived. When she managed to sing Over the Rainbow, even the skeptics felt the old electricity return. By early 1969, newspapers were openly wondering whether she could continue performing at all. Friends worried for her safety, but Garland did what she had always done. She stepped back into the spotlight. The stage was not just a workplace for her, it was oxygen. In March of 1969, just 3 months before her death, she performed in Copenhagen. By then, her body was visibly fragile. Her emotional reserves were nearly depleted. Yet she stepped onto the stage again. The set list was hauntingly familiar. Songs she had carried with her for decades. Songs that had outlived marriages, studios, and cultural revolutions. Most significantly, she sang Over the Rainbow. One must imagine the weight of singing that specific song after such a life. It is a melody forever tied to youth, hope, and innocence. For the woman singing it in 1969, it was a heavy burden. The Copenhagen audiences were not blind to her condition. They saw the exhaustion, but they also saw the courage required to stand there. Every note was a small act of defiance against gravity. This final run of performances raises a lingering question about her career. What makes an audience love a performer who is clearly breaking? Is it admiration for the art? Is it empathy for the suffering? Or is it a recognition of our own struggles reflected in someone larger than life? Garland never performed like a distant star. She performed like someone inviting the audience into her private weather. That invitation created a bond stronger than flawless technique ever could. But living that openly left her without armor. On June 22, 1969, Judy Garland was found dead in her rented Mews house in London. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was an accidental overdose of barbiturates. The news traveled instantly. Shock gave way to mourning. And then, a remarkable shift occurred. At her funeral in New York City, more than 20,000 people gathered outside the funeral home. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the streets. They did not know her personally, but they felt they did. Broadway theaters dimmed their lights in tribute. Radio stations filled the airwaves with her recordings. In the wake of her death, the narrative corrected itself. The stories of the booze in Melbourne, the glass in London, and the food poisoning in Baltimore faded from the immediate consciousness. What remained was the voice. What remained was the vulnerability. What remained was the memory of a woman who had walked onto stages again and again, even when the world could see exactly how much it cost her. The story of Judy Garland is often framed as a tragedy, and in many ways, it is. But focusing solely on the tragedy misses the point of her legacy. The real story was never about the night she was booed. The real story was about what she did afterward. She returned, she sang, she connected. The question that echoes long after the curtain falls is whether a legend is defined by flawless performances or by the courage to step back into the spotlight after falling apart. Judy Garland was never the safest performer. She was never the most predictable. But she was perhaps the most human. Her voice still reaches across the decades, not because it was polished, but because it was alive with feeling. When Judy Garland sang, the listener didn't just hear music. They heard survival. They heard heartbreak. They heard a fragile, stubborn hope refusing to disappear. Yes, there were nights when Judy Garland was booed off the stage, but those moments do not diminish her legacy. They illuminate it. They remind us that behind the legend was a person battling fears that the audience rarely sees. And they remind us that sometimes the bravest thing an artist can do is simply walk back into the light.